Hello and welcome to whatever this is. We don't have a name for this yet, but this will be a film podcast of some sort, focusing more on niche topics, I suppose, within film, perhaps some topicals, some not, just whatever fancies our interests, of which we'll dive more into in this episode. But I guess first thing we need is a name. So I had a few ideas I'm going to pitch to my fellow podcast host. Well, before that, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. So I'm Linus. I guess I'm on this podcast because I did study film in university. I didn't do film production, which is like what a lot of people do. So when they say they went to film school, that's usually what they mean, which essentially means that they made films. I did the other half of that, which is film studies, which is basically where you analyze films instead of making them. And since graduation, I've just been working in various films, various roles, mostly in the lighting department. And I've known Daniel for 2 years now, I want to say.
Yes.
And he asked me to do this podcast with him, and I was very excited to do it.
Actually, I didn't know you did film studies and not like film production. That's pretty interesting how you got into that. I guess thank you for saying my name because I didn't say it myself. My name's Daniel. I go by Olmech on certain social media platforms. And I have no experience within the film industry. I'm really just a film enjoyer. So in any case, I had some ideas for what this should be called, and I will pitch them to you live on air. So,
okay. Be honest though, are these AI generated? And did you come up with them yourself?
I did ask ChatGPT, and to be honest, like 99% of them were terrible. So I can pull.
That's my experience.
Some of them.
Asking it to come up with names as well.
Yeah.
So I've asked before, like, oh, you're gonna give me like company names. It's just like it usually tries to like really push the subject into the name. So if you say, oh, I want like film podcast names, it will just use like various words that are used in a film. It will be like Clapperboard Productions or something like that. It's just every word that we already use.
Yeah, I think ChatGPT, I'm an engineer, so I do actually have found uses for it for like coding specific things. But when it tries to become creative, it usually fails, and sometimes in pretty hilarious ways. I can just pull up some of the ones I was looking at. Let me see. So the prompt I gave it was like art house film titles that could be good names for a film podcast.
Okay.
The idea was to try to get like a film title that could also double as a film podcast title. But I didn't understand that at first. It was just giving me like very pretentious nonsense. Okay, things like cinematic reverie, celluloid canvas.
Oh my God.
Frames of expression, auteur odyssey. Okay. Dreamscape discourse. I think people would hate us if we picked any of those titles.
Probably, yeah.
And then I realized that a film title... so firstly, none of those were actual film titles, so it kind of failed that part. And then
it's kind of like words as well.
it just made up stuff that felt like, I guess, they fit together. But the film titles it did give me had like nothing to do with really podcasting that I could think of. So it gave me stuff like La La Land and like Pan's Labyrinth for some reason.
Okay.
Right. The Lobster. Okay. We could be a seafood podcast.
It's just naming films.
Yeah. Okay, so I gave up on ChatGPT. So a few ideas that I thought of. So I thought of like idioms or phrases within the film industry at first. Yeah. So something like the cutting room floor, which is like, it's the area where things are edited down within a film. And, I wasn't sure if it would give the idea that this would be more about film editing versus like film discussion. I kind of shied away from that. And there is also a podcast called The Cutting Room Floor out there.
Oh, okay, yeah.
enough.
That's an obvious reason to avoid it.
Yeah, although it's surprisingly it's not a film podcast. It's a fashion podcast. So,
Oh, right, yeah.
So I thought a bit more about I guess straight from that, and I thought more about like directors and some of the things that they've said. And one guy I was drawn to with how he expresses things is Stan Brakhage. And he has a very interesting, some people would say probably very pretentious way of putting things. But I think his use of language is quite interesting. So he talks about these metaphors for vision in some of the things I've read of his. And so like one thing he mentioned was closed eye vision. And what that kind of means is you don't stop seeing when your eyes are closed. Your eyes still see things like the light refracted through your eyelids, and you'll still see like shapes and patterns and whatnot.
Yeah, that's true.
But I also think it could refer to like cinema of the dream, like guys that we enjoy who make cinema that only feels like it could be from a dream, So
yeah, it sounds a bit like his films actually. Like his films very much have the light refracted on your eyelids aesthetic.
Yes, that definitely informed some of his films. And the other thing I was drawn to that he mentions a lot is the untutored eye, which is basically another way of him saying like how vision is something that can be corrupted, and to go back to kind of the free instinctual way that we viewed things is something where his idea of cinema can be more appreciated. And so yeah, those are some names I thought of, and they could be a little workshopped as well, but I guess any particular thoughts?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll workshop them. When you first said that your name suggestions come from like sayings directors said, for some reason the very first that popped into my mind is that Hitchcock quote where he said actors are like cattle. I don't know why that was the first one that came to mind, because that's like one of the most horrific quotes out there. It just popped into my mind. I was like, oh no.
Yeah, he treats them like cattle, certainly, in his films.
Yeah, he does.
So that would be an interesting podcast. So
yeah, I'm sure we'll maybe workshop those names and probably pick out one of them in due time, because we do need a name. I mean, we can't.
Yeah, I think Tarkovsky might have had some as well, but yeah, we'll look at them. Anyways, so whatever this is, today, what we'll be talking about is really just a kind of a sample list of questions to get to know us and our film taste a little bit more. So you can decide if you want to tune in to future episodes or block us from, your view entirely. So, hopefully the former.
Sure. Hopefully.
So let's see. Why don't we just jump right in? So this was a list of questions. They're pretty broad. We just thought of these as kind of fun and also things that can give little indications about our taste. So the first
it really is just sort of the goal of them really is to just sort of define, to maybe help people understand what our tastes are like. And they really just sort of range from our favorite films to maybe like our favorite directors or favorite performances. They're all quite broad, but hopefully just in talking about them, and as well as defining like how do we define something like our favorite film, maybe how that differs from a film that we think is maybe the greatest film of all time or something along those lines, and just based on that discussion figure out what our tastes actually are.
Yep. I think it should hopefully give you the listener an idea about what types of things we value in cinema, and maybe the types of films we will talk about in future episodes, although there's only so much you can extrapolate from these answers. Still, it should be fun. So firstly, I wanted to ask you about your favorite film right now, but before you give me the answers to what your very favorite film is, I want to know what's your process for picking out a favorite film. Do you have one that you've had for a long time, or is this one that's kind of a fluid, ever-changing selection?
For me, it is quite fluid, and it does change every once in a while. I do this thing. I picked it up from a mutual friend of ours, actually, where every 100 films he watches, he does like a list of his 10 favorite films or whatever. And I do something like that. I don't try to rank them too hard, but I just list down 10 films that come to mind every time I watch 100 films. So I'll do it like twice or 3 times a year. And it's just a good way to figure out what my favorite film actually is. And I think throughout my journey into film, my favorite film has changed quite a lot. Before I ever went to university, I think my favorite film must have been Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring.
Good choice.
Then once I started... Yeah, I think maybe it's a bit unexpected for some people, especially because it's the first film in the trilogy. I know a lot of people like rate the third one really highly. If I'm not mistaken, the third one was actually the one that won an Oscar, while the other 2 didn't. I might be wrong on that though. But I think just from a filmmaking point of view, the first one is really magnificent, the way it's shot, and I also think it's, out of the 3 films, it's the most complete story. I mean, you need to watch all 3 of them for the full story, but the first one in particular has like quite a complete arc of the Fellowship itself, because it starts with them forming and ends with them sort of falling apart, and especially Boromir's arc ending in him dying. But as I progressed into film, my tastes started sort of evolving, and then for a long time my favorite film was 12 Angry Men, which I'm pretty sure I watched for the first time in university. And then right as I was about to leave university, my favorite film changed again, and then for a little while it was Fallen Angels, the Wong Kar-wai film, just because I watched it and sort of the style of it really blew me away, and it connected really deeply with me. And I think that really marks the tipping point where I went from my favorite film being just films that I thought were really brilliant on like a technical level, or just were like really enjoyable to watch, like 12 Angry Men. It doesn't connect with me per se, but I just think it's like almost like a perfectly made film. But Fallen Angels, I think it has a lot of flaws, but that's where films that sort of connect with me more on a personal than a technical level started to appeal to me. And then after that film, I think sometime last August, I watched 3 Colors Red, and that has been my favorite film since then.
Going back to a film trilogy, where you began.
This time it is the final film of the trilogy.
The Return of the King of the 3 Colors movies, truly.
No, I'm very devastated that no Kieślowski films cracked the Silence Out list that came out last year.
Yeah,
didn't crack the top 100 at least.
That was so surprising to me. I wouldn't say like Kieślowski is one of my favorite filmmakers, but his work is, it's so huge within Sight and Sound, within the community, with everyone. It feels like a crime to ignore him entirely. It could just be there are too many choices or something, but it's silly to me. But
yeah, certainly I was pretty sad to see it miss out. Even though I try to go into those lists with like a very, very open frame of mind, and I don't get too sad that like say Buñuel missed out on getting any films in there as well. I'm like, he could have one in there, but it's fine. But this one is just because I love Kieślowski so much personally. It was like, oh no, not one film in there.
Yeah. Man, I'm pretty sure there were like probably several that missed out by 1 or 2 votes. I don't have it in front of me, but yeah. Anyways, your film journey is very interesting to me, because it's kind of like the iceberg meme of where
Oh yes, yeah.
You have the top layer where you get all the normie mainstream stuff, and then progressively as you go down, you get more and more the deeper
unhinged.
cuts, slightly more unhinged. Although I would still say, 3 Colors, Fallen Angels are,
those are still pretty hinged. Yeah,
they're fairly hinged. I'm sure you've watched plenty more unhinged stuff, but it's just interesting.
Oh, for sure.
It's interesting that progression, especially because to kind of contrast it with mine was unlike yours. I've only really had like 2 favorite films, maybe. And I know kind of exactly when the switch happened. So I guess going back to toddler Olmech / Daniel, or baby, I think my favorite film from when I was a kid was Disney's Fantasia. And just because of the spectacle of animation, the use of classical music, everything. I was big into classical music for a long time. So yeah, that
it's interesting that you have a favorite film as a child, because that didn't even cross my mind, even though I did like also watch like a lot of animated films, but I never thought to like go back, is Cars my first favorite film of all time?
Yeah, I only share it because it wasn't something like Cars or like Over the Hedge or something that I also really loved as a kid, but for whatever reason Fantasia made one of the biggest impressions on me, and it stayed that way. I wasn't really into film for a long time, so I'd only watched mainstream and films that everyone would see of the age I saw them, basically. But I did see 2001: A Space Odyssey when I was probably 10 or 11, and
oh wow, that young.
As you know, that film has a lot of classical music as well, and it was peculiar because it's a very slow film. It's something that kids wouldn't see or sit through. Certainly not today, I don't think.
Definitely not.
I guess for whatever reason, because I had that kind of entrance through classical music, and eventually I ended up working in the space industry. That's where I am today. So there were these kind of interesting seeds that I think seeing it at that young an age kind of planted, even though I didn't understand the film at all, really. Like, I don't think I knew what was happening in the last 30 or 40 minutes. But it was still, like, mesmerizing to young Olmech. So then fast forward to around age 21. That's my last year at undergrad university. And this is when I was actually starting to get into film proper. So, you watch, at least I watched a lot of the that kind of those upper tier iceberg films. And I did start going to the cinema proper to see not just new films, but like older films released in theaters again. And so this was 2018 when I was 21. So this was when there was a restoration done of 2001. Christopher Nolan actually headed that. He did like a restored, or I think they call it like a de-restored version of the 2001 original film negatives. And so they released that, and I really wanted to catch it because I knew how great of a film it was to me, even though I wouldn't say it was like all-time favorite yet. So I went there. To the ArcLight in Hollywood, which, rest in peace, was a great theater. Hopefully it comes back sometime soon. And
it closed down.
Yeah, it closed down, I don't know, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago.
Was it a COVID victim?
I think so. I think it also wasn't doing amazingly before then, but it's a historic theater. Saw a few films there. But the one other memory I have seeing it, aside from the film being an amazing big screen spectacle, was that there was a trivia question asked before the film, and I knew not much about the like trivia behind 2001, but I did know one piece of fact, and that happened to be the question that was asked, and so I was able to get it correct. It was what was the original composer to the film. And because I had a weird interest in music in particular, I knew it was Alex North, and so they gave me like a giant bag of kettle corn. So,
that's nice.
Yeah. So for all that, it kind of cemented itself as one of the best films for me. And then I saw it again in theaters in 70 millimeter IMAX like a month or two after that. So it was like a big year for 2001. It was a 50th anniversary year. So that basically
the interesting thing is sorry, go ahead, finish.
Oh, I was just gonna say that all basically cemented 2001, and I've really only considered the best film for me to be like the most impactful film upon my film journey, my interests. And so 2001 is very intertwined with multiple interests I have, not just in film, but in kind of life. So for that reason, it's really stayed at the top spot for the last, I guess, 5 years now. And I don't see it ever really falling. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've actually never seen 2001. And a big reason is actually what sort of you spoke about. At some point in time when I was getting into film, I did like the classic thing of watching a bunch of like Kubrick films. So I watched like Barry Lyndon, The Shining, Clockwork Orange, etc. But by some stroke of luck, I didn't get a chance to see 2001 during that initial binge. And now I'm actually really glad that I didn't, because I'm essentially saving my first viewing because I want it to be in a cinema on a big screen, preferably like an IMAX or something along those lines, just because now I have sort of an understanding of the high sort of regard that it's held in, and I'd like my first viewing to be in that sort of zone, because I made the mistake with Lawrence of Arabia, where I just watched it like on a computer screen. And even though I love the film, I really regret that I did that. I wish I had just waited, even if it's like 5-10 years, just to see it for the first time on a big screen. So that's what I'm doing with 2001 now.
Yeah, ordinarily I would eviscerate you for not having seen 2001, but that is an acceptable reason for not having seen it. It is incredible. And the thing is with 2001 is there are a lot of details in the film that really, I think you need a giant screen to see, honestly. So, yeah, I mean, aside from the kind of spectacle of it, there are lots of details in the film that I think a giant screen only can really lend itself to showing. So, yeah.
I think you sort of touched upon this already, but was it easy for you to single out 2001 as that film, or were there like other films that were like in really close regard? Like it's almost like, oh, it's like they're a hair away from being my favorite.
Yeah, to be honest, nothing is that close. I do have lots of other films I love, and if I had to do a top 10 list, there are very strong favorites in the 2 through probably 5 range. That also made almost perhaps as good of an impression on me. And really the difference will just be because of those kind of extra circumstances and influences on my life. So yeah, I would say it's not incredibly close, which is why I don't exactly see a film overthrowing 2001 for me, but it's, maybe it'll all happen someday. Who knows? Yeah.
Were you ever worried that maybe one day you would rewatch it and you wouldn't like it as much?
I don't think so. It's not one I really see a lot, but I have probably seen it maybe 5 or 6 times total now.
Oh, so you've seen it a bunch already, yeah.
I've seen it a bunch, and it doesn't lose its power. And I think part of it is it's a film that, as you may know, but you haven't seen, it doesn't explain itself really. It has this very enigmatic quality to it that makes it kind of timeless to me. And I remember when I first saw it, or I think it was maybe a few years after I saw it, but after maybe 1 or 2 viewings, I went through like a rabbit hole of like internet theories about what does a monolith mean, and then there's kind of these kind of crackpot theories about what the meaning of the monolith is that I was reading, that some guy had analyzed to like an insane degree of detail. And to be honest, this theory is probably entirely made up and not at all what Kubrick meant, but it's still fascinating how his films have that kind of obsessive quality to it that can be analyzed to that degree. Like The Shining is also maybe another similar example of a film people analyze to death, trying to find any sort of extra clues about, who knows what.
Any hidden meanings, for sure.
So I'm going to segue from favorite/most impactful film to most impactful director. And with this question, I think what I would like to ask is not necessarily favorite director, which is kind of what we were going with film, but the director that either impacted the films that you know of, I guess from your view of film history, which director had the most impact? And this is kind of an objective question, but also I'd say not really. So it's kind of a question that mixes objectivity and subjectivity, unlike I think all the other questions that are really pretty subjective. So what film director do you think has just the biggest place within film history?
Yeah, so I think my answer is sort of dependent on how I sort of defined the term most impactful. And for me, it was a mixture of influence and cultural impact. And I think my answer, and maybe answers that I was really close to picking, will reveal how I took those into equation. So I was really between three choices. My three choices were Hitchcock, Godard, and Fellini. I think the third one is probably the most surprising to people, but I think all of them had an incredible amount of influence over film as a whole, and at the same time, at their cultural peak of popularity, there's very few filmmakers ever who reached that sort of level of popularity. And I know there's a lot of other names that you could name on the short list. Certainly someone like Fritz Lang, John Ford. There's a bunch of other people who could be on here, but I isolated these three. And I think in particular I then sort of stopped at specifically just Godard and Fellini, because after some consideration I found that the 60s were probably the most revolutionary period in cinema, and probably the most important period in cinema in shaping how sort of film history shaped out to modern day. Because when you look at film in the 50s, it's actually kind of in a dire state. I mean, you look at America, and this is the decline of the golden era, especially the latter half of the 50s and sort of early 60s before new Hollywood cinema started. You look at Europe, and France is in this like very sort of meandering state. Yes, you have Jean Cocteau and Bresson making good films, but the golden era of French cinema was in the past with French realism, like 10 years ago at this point in time. You look at Italy, and it's the same thing. It's basically just Fellini doing interesting stuff. Nobody else is really around at this point in time. Neorealism had ended. Even if you look elsewhere in Europe, German, Russian, UK cinema certainly isn't known for a good 50s output. So all cinema around the world was sort of in this stasis, until essentially people like Godard and Fellini, and obviously other French New Wave directors, really sort of changed the cinema as a whole. So my choice out of those two was Fellini. And I think the reason why has more to do with cultural impact than influence. Because when I look at Fellini, I think there's basically no debate whether there is a more important filmmaker in Italy. Like I said, he was working in neorealism, and he was taking Italy over this period of time, and there wasn't a lot of other big names working. And throughout this period, he sort of carried Italian cinema single-handedly, and then his film La Dolce Vita sort of changed Italian cinema forever. It obviously started the post-neorealism movement. Antonioni had a big hand in that as well. But what this really did is it opened up doors for Italian cinema to no longer focus on the themes of neorealism. Films moved away from just focusing on these sort of poor people in scenarios where they're sort of struggling. And that opened the doors to all sorts of things. Obviously, spaghetti westerns, giallos, poliziotteschi, lots of different stuff that now had sort of an avenue to actually exist and market itself. But also just cultural impact. The size of Fellini is, I think, almost unmatched in history. Like, for people who don't know, he was so big at one point in time that he literally named films after himself. Like Fellini's Rome, for instance. I'm not just saying Fellini's Rome because he made the film. That's the actual name of the film. He named it after himself because his name in Italy was so big that it brought an audience just having it in the title. And it was like a lucrative financial decision to include it. But also in terms of influence outside of Italy, I mean, in America, he had a massive impact on new Hollywood cinema developing. Scorsese sort of cited and spoke about him multiple times in the past. They were very good friends when he started making his films. But you can really see on a film like Taxi Driver, Fellini's I, Vitelloni had like a very sort of big impact, big influence, because it focused on these sort of young delinquents who are sort of lost in life. And that was like the major theme in some of Scorsese's early work, where it focused on characters like Travis. I don't remember his surname from Taxi Driver, but he's very much like almost like a Fellini-esque character in that sense. But also certainly on directors like Lynch, who took some of Fellini's more surreal aspects and worked them into his films. But also not just in America, but in Europe as well. Like especially if you look at someone like Ingmar Bergman. You look at his output in the 50s and it's very like, I want to say like dour almost, like it's very, very dry, serious, existentialist. And then when you're seeing his work in the 60s, the way it evolves very much takes that same modernism direction that Fellini helped sort of embrace and push forwards. And then he suddenly comes out with a film like Persona, which has these like Fellini-esque aspects, very like modernist, subjective, very strange. It starts playing with form, and the narrative is not really told linearly, and it's very sort of experimental piece of work, which was quite different for Bergman, even though he was slowly getting there throughout the 60s as he sort of exposed himself to more French New Wave and Italian films.
Yeah, you make a great case, and I also hope that you get to a point in your career when you can name films after yourself, and that's just the marketing for them. So, no, yeah,
that would certainly be an impressive point to get to, because even when we think of like modern day directors, like I think the closest one probably was Tarantino in the 90s, because like I'm not sure if you even like remember this period, but there was a time when a lot of films that weren't made by him had like Quentin Tarantino introduces or something like along those lines before the film to like almost trick people into thinking it was made by him.
Oh yeah,
and just bring in some extra viewers along.
Yeah, he was instrumental in, I guess, bringing attention to like both foreign films and other indie films from America at that time period. I think to address your answer, Fellini, I think, is one of the few directors that has an adjective form of his name, like Fellini-esque.
That's true.
Which I think means something. There's probably only a small handful of directors that have that name that is attached to them. I guess Lynchian is another. And so it's a good answer. It's kind of funny. Do you know who the first person I thought of was when I answered this question? It's not the person I landed on, but just the first person I thought of.
Was it Fellini as well?
It was not Fellini.
Was it Hitchcock?
But a person very close to Fellini, time-wise, country-wise.
Antonioni,
yes.
Wow.
I thought of Antonioni as the very first person, mainly because of how I see Antonioni in a lot of the films that I watch, which is, it's a more parochial view, I suppose. But he was, I think, one of the biggest names in terms of obviously establishing like the ennui, the kind of listlessness of the upper class of Italian society back then, but that had ramifications and long reaching influences over things like the Taiwanese New Wave in the 90s and I guess 80s, 90s, which was about the kind of disaffection of people within this new Taiwanese society following their separation from China. And then there are other kind of maybe more one-off directors as well, like Weir Sethakul. I see Claire Denis' work as having Antonioni-esque kind of roots as well.
Yeah, I can certainly see that, yeah.
Yeah, so he was the first person I thought of, but I didn't pick him, partly because I do find his influence not really reaching to the kind of mainstream of film. This is, I would say, a little more niche than, if someone, like as you were saying with Fellini, which inspired people from Lynch and so on. I also thought of some of the very first directors. So guys like D.W. Griffith and Sergei Eisenstein, I think in particular, were the two of the names I thought of. And, you know, kind of obvious reasons, because they were some of the first people to codify and invent the filmic techniques that were used and perhaps mastered better in future films, but they were like the grandfathers, the godfathers of this form we call cinema. I didn't pick either of them either. And I think the main reason is just that I wanted someone who had a sizable impact that people would know of still to this day. And not just someone who I guess developed one particular, or like a kind of the very first example of either montage or with Griffith, you know, with Eisenstein, but and Griffith who did a lot more, and also Griffith is a very kind of controversial figure these days. Not that it detracts from his influence,
deservedly so, I'd say. Yeah.
So, anyways, I think I beat around the bush long enough. I landed on Godard as one of the first three you've said. And the case for Godard, well, firstly, I think Godardian is also an adjective that people have used. So that checks the first box. And I think of him as perhaps the most notorious director in a way. So I guess filmically, there were things that he was the first to do, really, and the first person that influenced many other directors, and things like using jump cuts, the handheld camera approach to film, and the kind of improv nature of his films as well. It has his films, you know, 60s films at least, have this jazz quality to them that were unlike anything before, as you were laying out in the 50s.
Especially Godard's films, because like for people who don't know, like he would literally go on set with no script whatsoever, and he just film random stuff, like with that sort of the thing he really sort of pioneered is just grabbing these 8mm cameras. Just he would often film from a wheelchair, so someone would wheel him around, and that's how he'd get that sort of movement effect. And the 8mm cameras notoriously were a lot cheaper to film with than like the cameras they were using out in Hollywood.
Right, and yeah, they were writing, I guess, parts of his film like the day of, or as you were saying, just going in with the camera and filming what they could or wanted to. So yeah, those approaches to film, you know, very revolutionary then. And I think Godard has a sizable impact on the mainstream, which was that quality I think Antonioni didn't have. And you could see that through things like Tarantino, who, you know, I think has a lot to say about Godard, and a lot of things you could see in his movies, like the classic dance scene in Pulp Fiction being an allusion to the dance scene in Bend Apart. You have guys like Wes Anderson, I think, whose aesthetic came quite a bit from some of Godard's films from the 60s, like La Chinoise, his color films in particular. So, yeah, I think it's a little hard to say. The other thing with Godard is the French New Wave, I guess, is more speaking broadly about the French New Wave, was perhaps the foremost wave that had an impact on film at the time. It inspired the kind of filmic techniques of other waves across other countries as well. You think of the Czech New Wave. You can think of other... like
all the new waves,
basically all of them. But even like just kind of random films of the 60s around the world, you'll see at the time, you just can't help but think of the French New Wave in particular. And a lot of them, you know, Godard was obviously not the only person there, but I think being kind of the most notorious name, the one who had maybe the strangest cinematic language, so he kind of stuck out maybe the most. It was just the reason I landed on him.
Yeah, I think certainly there are other New Wave names that also deserve a shout out, but weirdly the one, I think a lot of people would gravitate to Truffaut, but weirdly I think the one that also had a massive cultural impact and massive influence was Alan Resnais. I think I butchered his surname, but it's the guy who directed Night and Fog and Hiroshima Mon Amour. And in particular because he did sort of pioneer the modernism movement more than anyone. And after that, we saw that you see that really spread, particularly throughout Europe, where you had a lot of these films told through a subjective point of view. And again, like a really good example of that is Persona, because it uses that unreliable storytelling technique to sort of tell the whole film. But French New Wave in general, I mean, like I said when talking about Fellini, like these 60s directors both revolutionized and almost saved cinema, because especially in America at this point in time, the Hays Code had really dampened the progress of cinema, and all the big films they were making at the time, they were no longer bringing in a financial return. That's what it really was, like the end of the golden era. And after watching the French New Wave films, people like Scorsese and Cassavetes went out and then made their own films that were very sort of inspired by these films, and they focused more on like these anti-heroes and really sort of like morally gray characters that had something dark about them, and started telling these like much darker narratives that just would not have flown previously under Hays Code, and they made them under really small budgets, and those films started bringing in big returns, and that saw the start of new Hollywood cinema, which then again sort of changed what cinema has evolved to this day. And in other places for Europe, like after the French New Wave, I think the movement that most closely followed would probably be New German cinema, also sort of heavily inspired by a lot of those ideas that were pushed out there in the New Wave, and it's really like sort of revolutionized film all around the world.
Yeah, it was a big hotbed, I suppose, Europe at that time, of revolutionary cinema, starting from 1960 basically onward. So, yeah. Italy, France, and then eventually Germany, and then look to Northern Europe as well with Bergman. There are so many countries and directors at that time that were pioneering their own cinematic form, language, types of film. So, yeah.
For sure, yeah. Shall we jump to the next question then?
Yeah, something maybe a little more
guilty
fun.
Pleasures.
Yeah. So,
right.
Yes. You want to introduce it?
Yeah, I can do it. Yeah. So our next category, as I just sort of revealed, is our guilty pleasure films. And I kind of struggled with this category. I don't know if you did. I think it maybe has something to do with the fact that I studied exploitation film in university. So whereas maybe like the obvious guilty pleasure answer would be a film that's maybe like bad on some objective criterias, but that you still enjoy regardless. But the whole sort of idea of exploitation film is that you learn to not judge those films based on whatever sort of quality measurements have been sort of enforced on you, and you sort of appreciate them for different values entirely. Maybe it's like campiness or whatever else. So for me, it was a bit hard to pick out a film that I would sort of feel generally guilty about. I don't know if you had similar challenges, or did you just have an answer right away?
Yeah, so there's like the logical part of me that thinks you really shouldn't be guilty about the films that you like. Unless it's like a piece of Nazi propaganda or something, in which case you probably should feel incredibly guilty. But
probably should be, yeah.
Yeah, but other than that, for the 99.9% of films out there, I really think you should like what you like and not really care about what any other people have to think or say. But obviously, we're all human, and I think we all have some. Even if you might not say you don't care, I think there's a little part of you that cares what other people would think about your film tastes or things like that. And so
probably, yeah.
And so, yeah, tapping into that, I guess that part of me, it's like, what type of film would I be? I don't know if embarrassed is the right word, but would I be like, yeah, that film is great, but I don't really want to bring it up at the next art house film meeting that we all go to. I sort of did it on a basis because I struggled to come up with any answer. I sort of envisioned myself in a scenario where I was talking to 5 people,
and they were all trash talking this film, and I was trying to work out would I defend this film in this situation, or would I just agree with them, or just stay quiet entirely? And a few films came to mind first. These were sort of less films that were bad that I enjoy, but more so films that sort of maybe have their own peculiarities. So the first answer that came to mind was Midnight in Paris, the Woody Allen film. There's obviously a very obvious sort of reason why you might feel guilty about liking this film, but even aside from that, I just find that Woody Allen films have this like neurotic insecurity to them, and I guess that's like part of the appeal. But at the same time, you sometimes just watch them and you want to take a shower afterwards, and it's like you're not proud about liking a Woody Allen film. It's just like it's a bit embarrassing to admit to people. And I think like a similar film along those lines was also like Black Swan. Maybe just because of how Aronofsky is as a person, just gives off like, I don't know, like almost a very preachy vibe. And obviously there's the whole controversy with Black Swan as well, where he allegedly plagiarized Perfect Blue. But you know, admitting that you like an Aronofsky film, I almost compare it to like admitting that you went to like a vegan festival. Like, even if you're vegan, you don't want to brag about that necessarily.
That's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, especially because he's vegan himself, and he makes that sort of abundantly clear in films like Mother. But yeah, the answer I settled on in the end sort of disregards what I said about exploitation films at the start, because I settled on Christmas Hallmark films. And for people who don't know those, it's those films that get memed on like various social media platforms, where they all have the same poster.
Yeah.
Like a random stock white guy in a green jumper, random stock white woman in a red dress. It's like the classic poster all along. It's like those films, all of them are so horrible, but sometimes they're just, you know, good background noise, or just good fun to watch. I don't know.
Can we just applaud the fact that this was before AI generated images, so they were all like individually
True.
made, so that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have a better answer than Christmas Hallmark films? Is there a specific film that stands out to you?
Yeah, there is, I suppose, one, because I saw this film maybe within the last year, so somewhat recently, and it really surprised me. I thought it would just be like a dumb comedy movie, given the reputation of the lead actor. But I actually found Happy Gilmore to be an actually good comedy, straight up. Yeah, and I would defend this movie if anyone spoke ill of it. And it's something that I don't think I've really seen Adam Sandler comedy films. Just due to their reputation that they have, where he has the reputation of being a guy that just works with his friends and mails it in and is pretty unfunny.
Yeah.
I've seen clips from, like Jack and Jill and a few others.
Yeah.
But before he made all those, like, this was made in the 90s. It turns out he actually is a really good actor and can be really funny in the right role. What I think makes this film great to me is Adam Sandler. He's like, on paper, a guy you should absolutely not root for in this movie. He's someone that beats up people at the slightest bit of agitation. Yeah, he's just kind of a crazy violent person. But he's endearing the entire movie. Like, you cannot help but cheer for Happy Gilmore, which is his actual character's name. And I don't know. It's funny throughout the entire movie, and I mean it's no. The plot will not surprise anyone in terms of the structure and how it goes, but I mean there's just so many great scenes in this movie. I would very much recommend to people open to Adam Sandler movies.
Yeah, I think I've only seen Happy Gilmore when I was like 12 or 13 on TV with like 20-minute long ad breaks every like 10 minutes. So I don't remember it that well, but I know that like out of like the big sort of mass of Adam Sandler comedies, this is the one that sort of people who aren't cinephiles often sort of also extract almost from that group of films and sort of praise occasionally. I don't think I've ever heard like a person who's like really big into films really like talk positively about any of those films. But I have heard like just various friends of mine just say, "Oh, you know, Happy Gilmore, I actually liked that film," or whatever, just out and about in the world.
Yeah, it's like the horseshoe theory in politics, where it's like at some point your taste will wrap around back to the mainstream, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah. I think that's all I had to say about Happy Gilmore. Why don't we?
Yeah, shall we jump to the next question that we have, which is our favorite film performance. Do you have your favorite film performance?
Yeah, so I am someone that doesn't really rate performers, I would say. So it's a little interesting because I'm not really as drawn to actors or actresses when I watch movies. And, you know, when someone says like, "Oh, this actor gave an amazing performance in this movie," that doesn't really make me any more interested in the film. I think the main reason is that's kind of the baseline I expect of any movie, is that the actors all give good performances. And it's really hard to like compare performances against each other because everyone's playing a different part. And, you know, the ones that get noticed are the ones that are generally maximalists, larger than life sort of performances. And maybe they should get credited to some degree, but I really think great understated performances go maybe more unnoticed. Those are maybe the types of performances I'd probably try to champion more, even though that's not the type of performance I chose here. So it's a question that I think I'd kind of struggle to find an answer to like a single favorite. I picked one from a favorite movie of mine that I think the movie only really works as well because of this performance, and that is Naomi Watts in Mulholland Drive. And the reason for this, Naomi Watts, if you've seen this movie, she has to play the same character, but under so many different layers. And I don't want to spoil exactly how the movie goes, even though it's a little hard to do that. But she plays an actress new to Hollywood. She's trying to make it big in the city. So she's, she's introduced as this kind of wide-eyed, naive actress. And then there's a point in the movie where she has to give an audition, and she gives this very mature performance that you wouldn't expect from this kind of out-of-town country girl that didn't seem to have that kind of depth within her. And then at some point in the movie, you notice that her character changes. And the performance you haven't seen the entire movie, is kind of cast into doubt, I should say. So I really think you need. It's generally it's one of the more maximalist performances I've seen, I suppose. Throwing that word back out there. And the film, I think, really works because of how well she's able to play. It's one character, but she plays kind of this fractured look at her psyche.
Multiple personalities,
Yeah, and I've always been drawn to that kind of doubling or even tripling of different identities within the same character. I think that requires a lot of skill. But again, it's kind of contradictory to what I was saying earlier about understated performances going more unnoticed. But I'd have to think a lot harder and try to dig up one that I found as impactful as Naomi Watts in Mulholland Drive.
Yeah, I think I generally have a lot of thoughts on the whole idea of judging performances in films, and certainly a lot of very hot takes as well, I'd say. So it might be interesting in the future just to do like a whole episode on this topic. But basically, at some point in time when I maybe wanted to make my own films, I realized that I would have to learn how to direct actors. And for me, the first step of that was figuring out how do I judge a performance, because I was sort of very much like you, where that was something I didn't pay much attention to. And often I still don't, unless something about it catches my attention. And And I guess what I've realized the things I'm personally drawn to are certain elements such as the physicality of the performance, how an actor uses their whole body, how they command space, draw attention to them, how they bounce off with other people when they interact with another person in a scene, and how well they utilize and create space for that other person. So I think a good example of all of these for me would be, and this is not my answer to the question, but I think it's certainly a very good performance. It's Orson Welles in Touch of Evil, because that almost is the main reason why you would watch that film in the first place. Like, yes, certainly it has other really good aspects to it, but the main draw of it is Orson's performance. And when you look at, first of all, just how he embodies and creates the character, it almost operates on two levels. Yes, you have the actual sort of hideous personality of the character, like he really is this like racist, horrible person, but how he chooses to portray it visually by like chewing on the cigar, by having all like the disgusting because at this point in time he wasn't even fat, like that was all makeup prosthetics making him look really like visually hideous and disturbing, and the way he's shot and the way he speaks in this like low growly voice, it does like even before you sort of see his actions, it immediately off-puts you from the character. And he certainly, even though he's the villain and he's playing this, well, not minor role, but he's not the main character of the story. In every single scene that he's in, Orson is the one who's commanding attention. You're paying attention to him, you're paying attention to his performance, and like I said, it's very physical. Like he chews on the cigar and he just does a lot of facial movements and moves his body in a particular way that makes the performance really stand out. My actual answer to this question, however, is Isabelle Adjani in Possession. And this is maybe interesting because it's a performance that a lot of people hate. It's a highly polarizing performance because for people who don't know, Zulawski, particularly in this film, he employed experimental theater techniques. So he looked at experimental theater and essentially applied a very expressive performance style to the film, and the goal of this performance is almost the opposite of what Daniel spoke about earlier, where he almost doesn't want to notice the actor there, and he's just hoping that they sell the film. And in this film, the actors very much call attention upon themselves because their performance is very unnatural, it's very exaggerated, and it is almost like the extreme version of all these qualities that I mentioned. She's very physical, very expressive, particularly for the people who have seen the film. There's that one scene, everyone knows which scene I'm talking about, where she's just completely going nuts, especially with the physicality of the performance. But also the way she sort of bounces off with the other actors in the film, other characters, that weird like yoga character, Sam Neill as well, the way she's sort of interacting with them, having these almost like, I almost can't imagine how they could have been acted out of the script. I have to believe that they were improvised, like those massive arguments, because they just seem like, I as a writer, I cannot even conceive how you put something like that on script and have it actually materialize. So I have to almost think that was totally improvised. But as well, just the thing that really stands out about this performance to me is using your body as a tool to express emotion. A lot of the things people are normally maybe attracted to is the face and showcasing emotions, like for instance sadness through crying, and that certainly is a skill. But I think the face is almost the shortcut to a good performance. Like if you want a good shot, just a guaranteed good shot, just go in for a close-up on the face, and if the actor's even semi-competent, it will be a good shot, just because that's like a very reliable technique that you can always fall back to. But in this film, it very much relies on using the whole body, of expressing a whole sort of variety of different emotions.
Yeah, I guess the two performances you mentioned, firstly, the Orson Welles in Touch of Evil, the way that filmmaking-wise, like the way that the camera captures him makes him even scarier with the use of close-ups especially. The kind of, I think he's also given some Dutch angles as well, some just...
Oh, yes.
That really shows just his imposing body, his imposing face. I how he has power basically as this really, heinous villain. I think it's a pretty masterful film, both the directing and the acting.
There's that one shot in Touch of Evil. I'm pretty sure it's the only dolly zoom in the film. Dolly zoom is essentially when you push the camera closer to the subject, but you're zooming out on the lens, or obviously the reversal of that at the same time, and it creates this effect that I think is most famous from Hitchcock's Vertigo. That's how he expressed the fear of heights, by using this technique, and it sort of creates this wobbly effect where it almost looks like the walls are closing in on you. And there's that one low angle Dutch angle shot of Orson Welles in that film where he stands up and he uses a dolly zoom as he does. So almost like you're almost getting sucked in closer to this character that you do not want to be close to.
Oh yeah, it's really imposing and terrifying. And the other performance, the Isabelle Adjani in Possession, I think is perhaps the most, what's the word? She is the most out of body performance, I guess, that I've seen probably. Yes, there is that one scene that, for I guess has made me a bit terrified of like subways or like I get the criticism with how perhaps over the top it might be for some people. It's not a subtle performance in the least, but I think with the kind of crazy psychedelic way that the film goes, and how the film just kind of ramps up in terms of paranoia, in terms of insanity, I think her performance is crucial to that. So
I certainly think like both of the main performances in film fit the film very well, because the whole film is this sort of like insane, mind-boggling experience. So I think even for people who potentially would, even if they had gone for a realistic performance, I think even the people who had been turned away by the performance would just have been turned away by the film anyways at some point in time, because of how sort of bonkers it gets as it progresses onwards from just like this mundane breakup story to absolute insanity. But the fact that Zulawski did sort of go for this experimental physical performance, it did fit the film perfectly.
Yeah, no question. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I would love to rewatch, and I think I didn't fully like dissect everything that happens, especially in the last third of the film. That it gets insane.
And I think certainly with you, I guess I'd also like to mention this, because just like you have gone for a very sort of extra over the top performance, but I guess one thing that I've also really learned to appreciate, especially as I was defining what I like in the performance, is sort of the value of the plain performance, because it doesn't usually get a lot of credit, because the whole role of the plain performance is to create a blank space and to create space for other people in the scene to shine. So a few examples of this would be like Clint Eastwood in the Dollars trilogy, where he doesn't particularly talk a lot. His job is really just to be there and look cool. And other characters in those films usually take the more eccentric roles that really get a lot of shine, and he essentially Clint Eastwood creates the space for them to have those eccentric performances and actually stand out. I think maybe more modern example of that would be the recent Barbie film, where I think Margot Robbie does a really good job at creating this blank slate for everybody else in the film, particularly Ryan Gosling, who has sort of got all the credit about the performances in the film pretty much almost single-handedly. But his performances in particular really, really heightened by what Margot Robbie does in that film to create space for him to actually do his thing.
That was a segue I was not expecting. from Clint Eastwood to Margot Robbie and Barbie.
Yeah, from Isabella Johnny in Possession to Clint Eastwood to Margot Robbie.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think the understated or the kind of cooler performance, as I was saying kind of up top, that those I think are almost, or if not equally as successful as these kind of ones we've highlighted. I just wish I could find, I guess, like a preeminent example of something like that. I even think Clint Eastwood might be, even him in his role, might be a little bit, like, he is doing a lot, even if it doesn't seem like it. There is a...
Oh yeah, he certainly adds some spice to the performance.
Yeah, the constant expression, like the kind of grimace on his face throughout the entire movie, that lends to that kind of cool aloofness of his persona, is still a lot of acting that he's doing. It doesn't have, I guess, the kind of craziness or the screamingness of the Johnny performance. But I think even the ones like I was thinking of, I guess just to give one example, like for people who've seen an Ozu film in particular, I think the way he gets his actors to perform is quite something. They're pretty understated, like his films are. Chishu Ryu is maybe his muse. He's in a lot of his films, and he does an incredible job with just a very kind of a delicate but humane, usually like a father figure to the characters in his movies, and I think he makes the films, successful, just as a Johnny or Naomi Watts or Clint Eastwood make their respective films successful. So again, I find it difficult to rate performances, but I think they're all good in their own way.
Yeah, I think Ozu is in particular a good example, because when you look at maybe some of the other Japanese films of that period, like the obvious example would maybe be Kurosawa films. I know one of the things that turns people off from a film like Seven Samurai is that some of the performances are sort of very, very heightened and expressive in a way that our performances in the West aren't. Like ours very much focus on that sort of realism aspects in general, aside from like the really extra ones like the Isabella Johnny performance, whereas Ozu does sort of, because his films are so much more low-key, his performances are also sort of more realistic and in tune with that as well.
Yeah, I think there's definitely cultural differences between Japanese filmmakers to filmmakers in America or in Europe with how they approach performances as well. But I think this is quite a big topic that I probably should do more prep on before things.
We might do like a whole episode on this one day. Yeah. Just really dive into maybe like multiple of our favorite performances and just various aspects. Because aside from performance, there's obviously also directorial approaches to consider. From maybe the very, I suppose, ones that have now been hailed really highly, like maybe Sidney Lumet's approach to directing actors, because he has almost never failed to get a good performance out of actors, and he has worked very closely to them. And sort of on the opposite end of that, you have someone like Hitchcock or Kubrick, who did treat their actors sort of like cattle and made them do like a million different takes. There's certainly a lot to talk about there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the actors like cattle, which is another suggestion for the name of this podcast.
Yes.
But I think we can get into the closing segment for this episode, since we've gone quite long. And I think we are planning to end every episode with a recommendation of some sort. It doesn't have to be a film one, but just anything that you want to give a little bit of a spotlight on as far as a piece of media goes. So why don't you go first? What was something that you've either seen or read or heard recently that you'd recommend?
I suppose I could do a film, but I think we've spoken about films for basically the entire podcast now. So I think I'll do a book one, just because for like the past 2 months I've been going through this book series, and I've been going through the Witcher book series. Not because of the TV show. I just felt like maybe I should finally get around to reading it, because I'm from that part of the world as well, Eastern Europe, and I'm quite interested in folklore as well as a research subject, and those books in particular are sort of doused in it, and I've just been going through the entire series. Although some books are weaker than others, the short stories in particular, the first 2 books really did sort of blow me away, and I enjoyed them. I enjoyed them quite a bit.
Interesting. Have you seen the TV series?
I've seen the first season and I didn't enjoy it, so I never continued to watch the second and third seasons.
Gotcha. Yeah, I haven't seen it, or I'm into TV, but I know people love it, so it's interesting. I actually wasn't aware there was a book version, so that's how out of touch I am with
now you know.
that series. Yeah, interesting. As for me, I think I will pick a film that I've seen recently. On my letterboxd.com account, I don't generally give 5 stars to films. I think I've given probably 4 or 5 this year, and to new films. And I gave one to a film last week, which I saw while ill with COVID, so I was trying to find ways to pass the time, and so I was watching these longer films I wouldn't normally have time for, and so I saw this film called Comrades by the director Bill Douglas from 1986, I want to say. And
sounds about right.
Yeah, this is a 3-hour epic film that is somehow both small scale and large scale in terms of its approach. So it's a long film with a lot of characters, but it has a very episodic nature to the film, despite actual events occurring. The film is about the topical martyrs, which is one of the first groups. They're a group of agricultural laborers in the topical village of England, and they were among the first to demand fair wages. Like they formed kind of a quasi-union before those. This was in the 19th century, so this was way before that was an established practice. And the film details their unionizing, their punishment for demanding for fair wages, and just the kind of, it has a brotherhood sort of nature to it, as the film title might suggest. And I think to me that's kind of what was very nice, very humanizing about the film, which was that all these characters are portrayed with an equal amount of empathy, at least all of the working class people in the film. And that's just something that's incredibly rare within films that I've seen. It has a very what's the word? It humanizes them to a really, I guess, significant degree.
You almost, with some films that have this sort of subject matter, you almost don't want it to be like poverty porn in a way,
right?
We are almost like glamorizing it. I think maybe like another example of the opposite would be someone like Aki Kaurismäki, the Finnish director, who really sort of goes to great lengths to empathize with the working class and really tell the film from their perspective and how life is for them. And that sounds like sort of a similar quality in this film. I have not seen it, but it sounds like it also really sort of empathizes with the working class.
Definitely, yeah. It's very empathetic, and Kaurismäki is an interesting comparison point. I think Kaurismäki has a similar quality as far as the characters go, even though his films are a lot more humorous in kind of his dry, understated approach. But they're very comforting in a way. Generally not a lot of conflict in Kaurismäki movies. They're films about just people and their kind of daily struggles in existence, working class people. And the film Comrades is, I'd say, larger in the kind of struggles that these people face, and quite, I guess it has that more epic quality that a Kaurismäki film doesn't. I also saw this new film directed by the Wim Wenders from this year called Perfect Days. And that's, I found quite interesting, but I didn't quite enjoy it the way that a lot of people have been. It's another film that looks at this working class man who's a bathroom cleaner in Japan.
Yeah.
And this is kind of an approach I don't really care for as much, where it romanticizes him to such a degree that it feels saccharine and unrealistic. Whereas you have this guy that he's reading, what is he reading? He's reading some, I want to say like Nathaniel Hawthorne or something like that. He's listening to like music on cassette tapes. He has this kind of like a persona that to me feels like a fake person, and that it feels too much like Wim Wenders is trying to romanticize this person that, you know, a lot of people would, you know, have prejudices against that. And I just find the more natural approach by Kaurismäki and Bill Douglas to be a lot more successful. Treating these people like real people, and not some sort of idealized version of what a working class person is or isn't. In Kaurismäki films, there's definitely like no one who's like a saint, or like Jesus, which you know, feels that way.
I think like the big difference, almost like on the most obvious level for people, would be the type of the actual story, not even necessarily how the characters are portrayed, but like in a lot of films that do have this sort of poverty glamorization aspect, it either sort of goes to great lengths to really bait sympathy out of you, or it specifically tells a story of the sort of like, not necessarily rags to riches, but it uses the classic hero's journey story structure and really sort of takes this person from like a poor person to something greater almost. And like a film that came to mind was like Slumdog Millionaire, for instance. And the films of Aki Kaurismäki don't really do that with the story arcs. They're more focused about the character dealing with the problems of the working class, and the solution for them isn't to leave the working class. It's usually found in the joys of the working class life as they exist. Trying to think of like a specific example from an Aki Kaurismäki film, but yeah, a lot of his films are just sort of resolved, and they are just about characters almost like saying, yeah, this is shit, but I'll survive, almost in a way.
Right. It's usually about people who are, yes, their jobs generally suck, and they don't have money really, but they're still have some sort of contentness about them because they're able to find ways to have fun and to connect with other people, try to form relationships, despite the struggles that often entail without the kind of comfort of the financial, without financial comforts, I should say. Yeah, I think that's well put. So I think we can wrap up this mammoth episode here. Maybe we can cut this into 2 parts. But yeah, we hope to be back at some point with the next episode. We'll see how our schedules align and what sort of rhythm we can get into with this podcast that we still don't know the name of. But until then, we'll sign off. My name was Daniel.
And I'm Linus.
And thank you for listening.